Hey everybody, check this out. I had an amazing conversation with Alex Newman. It was probably one of the best ever, and you're going to watch it right now. It's one of those you're going to want to like and share with everybody that you can think of. But to get the full version, also you want to go over to the app. But right now we're going to give you everything that we have. Just get ready to be rocked and be well informed. God bless you guys. Here we go. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Hope for Our Times. I have a very special guest today, and we're looking at all kinds of different things taking place. But my guest today is Alex Newman, and I'm going to ask Alex about the diabolical march to world government. We're going to work through that. We obviously have an election coming up. So please, Elka, welcome Alex Newman. Alex, thank you for joining me.
Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Pastor Tom.
This is superb. And you're going to be joining us at the End of the World Conference coming up just next week in Southern California. That's exciting. Thank you for accepting the opportunity, the invitation to come on out.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Well, we titled it The End of the World because a lot of people are going to think it is. We know Jesus is on the throne. But
Amen.
man, you've got your hands full with all kinds of things you're going to be doing. You're going to, as you call it, the Climate Clown Show. You finished the conference in Southern California. You're heading over to Asperjane. Wow, I got to ask you about that. You've been reporting on these COP meetings for a long time. So I want to get there in a few minutes. But as of right now, Alex, news this morning, Hezbollah has people that are leaving the ranks. They're wanting a truce. Iran is threatening to destroy Israel. All these different dynamics are going on. Israel is clearly winning with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. Did an amazing work with Iran. I was just over there about a week and a half ago. So we'll get to Israel if we have time, because I know people like to be updated on those things. You also have your thoughts. You could throw your thoughts out for Israel if you want, and any time in this, but I'm going to ask you about the diabolical march to world government. And so if you're ready to go, let's just roll with it.
Let's do it.
All right. So with that, we think of the biblical foundation, and God's intention was to divide mankind into nations, as stated in Scripture. We know what happened when we go back to Nimrod and so forth. So how do you see that, as you have talked about this before, with God's, the biblical foundation?
Well, thank you again, Tom. And so when you read God's word, it's very clear that he created certain institutions, certain moral laws for our benefit and for his glory. He created marriage. He created mankind made in his image. And one of the things that he chose to do, and theologians have discussed why and et cetera, but one of the things that he chose to do was divide mankind up into nations. And the story of that is in Genesis chapter 11. People can go back and read that. God had told the people to spread out over the whole face of the earth. And they said, no, actually, we're good. We're just going to sit here and build this big tower. We're going to reach up into heaven. And theologians have debated exactly the meaning of that. You know, what was this tower? Was it a literal tower? Were they trying to reach to heaven? Were they trying to avoid the next flood? Whatever it may be. But it was God's intention that mankind should spread out across the whole face of the earth. And man, being rebellious and disobedient, said, no, we're not going to do that. And so God finally forced the issue, confused their languages so that they had to spread out over the whole face of the earth. And we read multiple times in Scripture. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 32, and it's in Acts chapter 17, that God divided mankind. It says he even fixed the borders of the peoples. He even determined allotted periods for how long these nations would exist. So all of this is within the sovereign purview of God, just like so many other things are. And what would we expect Satan and his minions to do with the institutions, the moral codes that God has ordained? Well, we would expect Satan to wage war on those things. And so I think people need to understand, when you look at the globalist agenda and even the globalist ideology, if you can call it that, this isn't just like a different policy preference, right? It's like the people who wage war on family. Family is an institution that God created for our benefit and for his glory. And so, of course, we see Satan waging war on the family. And, of course, we see Satan waging war on nations. And when you think about the globalist agenda or the anti-family agenda or the anti-marriage agenda or even the anti-private property agenda, it was God who said, thou shalt not steal, thereby establishing a rock-solid immutable, permanent foundation for the institution of private property. When you see forces waging war against those things, we need to understand that this is part of the cosmic spiritual battle that the Apostle Paul describes in Ephesians chapter 6, and it's also described in Daniel and other places. The powers, the principalities, they hate God. They've enlisted a bunch of human beings in their war against God, and so they're waging war on nations. And so when you see this globalist agenda, this effort to create a one world system, forget the nice arguments they're making. Oh, it's going to bring peace. Oh, it's going to lead to the end of war. It's going to bring security and safety. Baloney. These things all need to be understood through the biblical context. This is an effort to undo what God has done, and therefore it is diabolical, even if a lot of the useful idiots promoting it may think they're well-intentioned.
Let me ask you this. You've warned about the potential for expanded wars, regardless of who wins the election. What do you believe is the primary factors, or are the primary factors that are driving these risks?
Well, I think through a biblical lens, it's satanic. We see Satan loves to see human beings killing each other and maiming each other. Satan loves to see war and terror and death and confusion. He hates us with an incredible passion because we're made in the image of God. And we can be redeemed through the Lord Jesus Christ, whereas he knows he's headed to the lake of fire. It's over. You're done. So he wants to take as many of us with him as he can. So he loves war. Now, in the physical, we have a very, very clear explanation of why these globalists, why these evildoers like war so much. They've outlined this in official documents, and we've seen this in practice. After World War I, they gave us the League of Nations, the first real attempt in the contemporary era to form a one-world governing system. That failed, so they just used World War II as the springboard, and they created the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the European Coal and Steel Community, which eventually became the European Economic Community, which became the European Community, which became the European Union. Now they're trying to replicate that regional government model around the world. And the guy who articulated this most clearly was actually in favor of this strategy. His name was Lincoln Bloomfield. He was hired by the U.S. State Department back in 1962. He wrote a report with the headline gives it away. It's a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And the goal of that report, and it was co-sponsored by the Institute for Defense Analyses, was to figure out how do we get from the Westphalian system of essentially sovereign nation states agreed to back in the 1640s to a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. And he didn't beat around the bush. His conclusion was very simple. War, the threat of war and crises are the fastest way to accelerate this process. He believed that through organic trends, it would take hundreds of years before we could finally get to this globalist utopia where we would get rid of nations. But he said if we accelerate that using war, crises, and the threat of war, we can get there really, really quickly. And he actually advocated for what the Europeans did. First, customs unions evolving into eventually federations, federated governments, bringing nation states under a regional government, ultimately paving the way for world government. So that's why they love war so much. That's why you see people in high positions all over the world, whether that be in Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or Tehran, or Pyongyang. They all love war for that reason. They think it's a way to expand the power of the state. It's a way to undermine the nation state. And, of course, it has been used to undermine Christianity very effectively in recent decades. I mean, you just look at the massacres of Christians that have been taking place across the Middle East at the hands of jihadists, many of whom have been backed by the U.S. government, unfortunately, armed, trained, etc. And you see all these benefits from a diabolical point of view of war and more war. So I suspect we'll see more of that. If Trump wins, we may see all hell break loose. We may see Moscow or Tehran or who knows, launch maybe even Beijing attacking the Free Chinese in Taiwan. And I think that would be one way of putting Donald Trump on defense, stopping some of the anti-globalist things that he has said he's going to do. And so, yeah, we're headed into, I think, some difficult times. If Kamala wins, we'll see more of what we have seen during Joe Biden, pouring jet fuel on the fire. Hey, more money for Iran, more money for Arab terrorist groups, more weapons for everybody, more stirring of the pot anywhere we can find a pot to stir. So I think they would love to see more war. And I think as followers of Jesus, we ultimately want peace. Now, we don't want peace at the expense of truth or justice or righteousness. When the communists talk about peace, they mean something very different than what Christians mean, right? When communists talk about peace, they mean we have eliminated all opposition. Nobody can resist us anymore. Same thing with the jihadists. Oh, we'll have peace once every square inch of the planet is under the control of jihadists. But we as Christians, of course, we mean something very different. But as Christians, we should want peace. But we also need to recognize that some things are worth fighting for, and we cannot just roll over like the Israelis are doing right now, right? You can't just roll over and say, "Oh, you want us gone from the river to the sea? Okay, well, we'll be on the next boat out," right? It's ridiculous. So sometimes there is a time and a place for fighting, but the globalists want it for very, very different reasons.
Indeed, they do. When Jesus comes back, he'll bring true peace, but prior to that, he's going to be bringing great judgment and making war against the evil. So if he's our leader, it's understanding righteousness versus unrighteousness. Alex, you're going to be speaking at the End of the World Conference, as you mentioned. I'm excited about that. You're the first speaker, and by the way, this is a benefit conference too for Gihon Springs, and Gihon Springs is an outreach that's in Israel, operates in Israel, and it's getting the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. Basically, it's ministering to Messianic believers that go into the IDF as the IDF soldiers, both men and women. They go into the battlefields. They're trained on how to stand strong in their faith, have the gospel with them as they're on the front lines. And I'm excited about that. It's actually a benefit conference. It's great to have all the teaching, Alex, as you know, but to understand, hey, the money I give is also going to this. I was looking yesterday at the news, and there was a Christian man that was killed in Gaza, one of the IDF soldiers, and the family has put a cross on his tombstone. And I guess there's a lot of issues that have been raised over that, or people are demanding over there that they take the cross off. But I think here it is. Here's the reality of it is, this is taking light into a very difficult battlefield while soldiers are they're scared, and these other soldiers that are believers in Christ are trained on how to live for Christ while on the battlefield and in life. And I think it's great that the conference is a benefit for Gihon Springs. But Alex, I want to thank you for joining us too, because you're first up. Well, actually, I'll open up, and then you're speaking first up on Friday. And again, I just want to thank you. We have a whole host of all kinds of speakers. Even Allison Steinberg's going to be coming out on Saturday. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And by the way, you can register online, everybody. You're not going to want to miss this. And again, the proceeds are going to it's a benefit for Gihon Springs. All right. So with that, we have Eric Stackelbeck. We have a lot of people that are going to be there. It's going to be really cool. Brandon Holthouse. A huge list. John Haller's going to be there. I think we have 16 different speakers. It's going to be great. Tim Thompson's going to be absolutely terrific. Let me ask you this. So you're speaking Friday, but then you've got to go. Where are you going? Because you're going to another one of your COP meetings. You go to these climate meetings every year, investigative journalism. Fill us in a little bit on that.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. And I can't wait for the conference. I'm really excited. It's going to be amazing, and looking forward to seeing a lot of the viewers there in person. That's going to be wonderful. So yeah, right after that, I'll be flying over to Azerbaijan, conveniently on the border of Russia and Iran. That'll be exciting. Right after the election. So pray for me. But I like to go to these. I try to go every year. I was in the Arabian Peninsula last year. Before that, I was in Egypt for the COP27. So I try to go to these every year. They're very, very important because the climate hoax, as Donald Trump calls it, I think quite appropriately, is really completely essential to this global agenda that they're pursuing. It underpins almost every one of the elements that they are pushing, including, by the way, the corruption and the usurpation of religion. They're trying to now get the Christians, the church involved in this jihad against carbon dioxide, which is utterly preposterous and utterly unbiblical. So I like to go there and expose. I think you and I talked about this, Tom. I was on the Sinai Peninsula in 2022 for the UN Climate Summit there, and all these religious leaders, self-proclaimed world religious leaders, marched up to the top of what they said was Mount Sinai, and they did a weird dance that I'm sure looked something like the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. They repented of their climate sins and their carbon emissions, and then they whipped out a new and improved 10 Commandments that really completely redefines morality, right? It's no longer about honoring and loving God and honoring and loving our neighbor. Now it's about honoring and loving Mother Earth and hearing the cries of Mother Earth. It's a totally new and demonic system of morality. So they did that. Then I ran into one of the organizers. He said, "Oh no, we don't just have the new and improved 10 Commandments. We're also working on a new covenant." He says the UN and Friends are going to bring you a new covenant. God gave us the old covenant. God gave us the new covenant. Well, the UN and Friends are going to give us this third covenant that he said we're going to use to build the kingdom of heaven here on earth. So all of this revolves around the climate hoax. None of this would be possible without the climate hoax. The dismantling of our economy, the dismantling of our energy infrastructure, the dismantling of our religious, ethical, and moral values. It all revolves around this hoax that is the idea that CO2 is toxic pollution, and that if you pay enough taxes to the UN and submit to enough restrictions on your freedom, somehow that's going to keep the temperature of the planet perfect. I mean, it's ridiculous to even say it, but it's such an important part of this global agenda that I feel almost an obligation to go there and, as Ephesians 5:11 says, expose and reprove the evil works of darkness, because that's what's going on in these things.
Oh yeah, I just love your reporting on these things, and I'm so thankful again that you're coming to the conference next week. And again, you can register online, everybody, but at hopefortimes.com. But Alex, for people who don't follow you yet, how can they follow you and subscribe? I get your newsletters every day, or almost every day. How can people subscribe and follow you?
Well, thank you, Tom. So easiest way is at my personal website, libertysentinel.org, and Sentinel is Sentinel, means watchman, soldier, guard, whatever. So libertysentinel.org. I'll be covering the climate summit, mostly for the New American Magazine. I serve as senior editor and foreign correspondent there. People can subscribe to the print magazine at thenewamerican.com. We'll be putting out a lot of videos, both through the newsletter, through Rumble, and all those kinds of things. And then I'm on X at AlexNewman_JOU. I've been back ever since free speech got restored, and it's a good place to be able to see the latest stuff that we're working on.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. You mentioned the UN. So the UN is pursuing a 2.0 version of to control global issues, including emergencies and education. You talked about climate. I look at the whole climate argument in the context of Romans chapter 1. They worship the creation rather than the creator. It's obvious what is going on, and they're easily manipulated because of that. But you also mentioned emergencies and education with this coming UN version 2.0.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So just a few weeks ago, I was at UN headquarters. This was the Summit of the Future, and not 1 in a million Americans heard anything about this, right? And that was by design. Internally, the UN was saying this is one of the most important summits ever. We're restructuring and reorganizing the UN. They actually framed it as we're going from UN to UN 2.0. And they were very, very open about what they were doing at the summit. And if you read the final pact for the future that they came up with, and I encourage people to read it for themselves, don't just take my word for it, it becomes very clear what they're doing. When the UN was originally set up, what they told the public, this isn't, of course, what they had in mind, but what they told the public was this was just about peace. This was just about making sure we didn't have another terrible war and that humanity would stop killing each other. Well, that turned out to be a lie. And many astute observers warned us that that was a lie at the time. A lot of communists involved, a lot of occultists involved. It was a bad, bad group of people. But you fast forward now almost 80 years, and you read this so-called pact for the future that they created, and they're very open about where they're going with this. They're telling you that they are restructuring the UN. They actually, all over the conference, they had these air quotes from Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Says, "We can't build a future for our grandchildren with a system built for our grandparents." In other words, the old systems are going to be replaced by new systems. And while the original version of the UN was just supposed to be dealing with peace and security, now the UN, and this is very clear in the Pact for the Future, now they want to deal with the economy, with education, with the environment, with public health, with business, anything, you name it. And one of the things that really jumped out at me, you mentioned the emergencies protocol. I think this is one of the most significant developments of this whole thing. And the whole thing is very significant. But it first came to my attention in early 2023. Guterres, who I mentioned, by the way, before taking over the UN, he was the leader of the Socialist International, largest alliance of communist and socialist parties in the world, traces its lineage directly back to Karl Marx, a satanic maniac, if you will. He comes out and he puts out this series of policy briefs. He called them policy briefs, Our Common Future. And number 2 was the one that really, they're all significant, but number 2 dealt with global emergencies, or what they called complex global shocks. And in this policy brief, the Secretary General argued that he and he alone should have the power to declare that there's a global emergency. That could include, it says in the report, environmental problem, economic problem, a war. It could include something from outer space. It could include a black swan event that we can't predict. It could include a regional conflict, so it doesn't even have to be global. And in the event that the Secretary General declares an emergency, it says all the players must recognize the primary decision-making authority of the United Nations. That's almost word for word in the policy brief. And so they enshrined that in action item 54 in the Pact for the Future that was adopted by every government in the world, by the way. Every single government in the world at least allowed this thing to pass. And what it does is it gives a mandate to the socialist running the UN, Guterres, to seize all power and all authority over nations, businesses, religious organizations, regional organizations, everything, in the event that he declares an emergency. So very, very dangerous. We know that the World Economic Forum is talking about we're headed into a polycrisis where all these crises will merge into one huge crisis. So I encourage people to just remember the last few years. We had the World Health Organization basically dictating to governments and businesses around the world, even right? You couldn't say things on if they went contrary to the recommendations of the World Health Organization. So imagine that now, that public health response, where an unelected, literal former ethno-Marxist terrorist leader was telling all the governments of the world what they had to do because there was a supposed virus out there that was going to hurt us. Now add that whole program to every other issue, right? Gun violence, racism, lack of quality education, you name it. The UN wants to lead the response to that. So this is a power grab like we have never seen in human history, at least in modern times. And it's now out in the open. And all you have to do is read this document yourself.
So this is really about a global dictatorship, which is exactly as we look at the Bible. This is the direction everything is going to go. We know there's going to be a 10-king system. You know, people argue on exactly what that looks like. But it looks to me, Alex, like this is what is actually in the formation right now, this system. We know there's going to be a 10-king system, and then they'll give their power and authority to this global dictator the Bible calls the beast. And so what we see really happening is the model for this, or I would even not say necessarily the model, but it's preparing all of the infrastructure, I guess.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way of putting it, Tom. And on this 10 King thing, one of the things that's really dealt with extensively in this Pact for the Future is reforming of the UN Security Council. They make the UN very difficult to understand, and I think that's by design. There's all these different power centers. You've got the Secretary General. You've also got the Security Council, which at least based on the UN Charter is the most powerful institution with the UN. It's the institution that has the power to deploy troops in response to real and imagined threats to peace and security. And so when you look at the reforms that they're talking about for the Security Council, the one that got the most attention was ending the veto. And so right now there's 5 permanent members on the Security Council, including the U.S. government, and any one of those can exercise its veto and stop the deployment of troops or any of these other major decisions coming from the Security Council. There's also the 10 rotating members. So that was the one that got a lot of attention. And of course, that's an extreme measure, right? We're talking about then the rest of the world being able to dictate to the United States things that we wouldn't be able to stop, even though we pay the bulk of the budget, even though we supply all of the things necessary for this entity to operate. But one of the more important ones that did not get a lot of attention, Tom, is the elevation of these regional governments. There's actually very open discussions now about the possibility of putting, for example, the African Union as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Well, the African Union's not a nation, right? We're talking United Nations. Why would you put a regional government that, by the way, has no legitimacy in Africa? I mean, this thing is funded almost entirely by American taxpayers, European taxpayers, and the mass murdering dictatorship in communist China. You ask your average African their thought about the African Union, they're like, what? And I spent a lot of time living in Africa. I can tell you this is not an institution that people have affection to. Why would you want to put this illegitimate entity with its own army? They're trying to build its own currency. It's got its own parliament in Addis Ababa. Why would you put that on the Security Council of the United Nations when it's not a nation? Well, that's the direction they're going. The EU is the model, and then you've got these regional governments proliferating around the world. And depending on, what day of the week you're looking at, there's about 10 of these. You've got the Union of South American States, the European Union. Putin's building the Eurasian Union. The globalists are advocating for a Middle Eastern Union where you'd put the Jews and the Turks and the Arabs and the Persians, the Kurds, all under one Middle Eastern superstate. So they're working on this now over time. And they're just waiting for the right moment, maybe for the right crisis or global emergency to say, hey, we'll make the chaos stop. You just have to give up these freedoms, agree to restructure the UN in this way, and then all your problems will stop.
Yeah, I see the world in a position right now saying, hey, if somebody were to come along and say, we can make all of this go away, it seems like almost everybody would say, please, because we're really tired of it. We got anxiety over just about everything. There's lawlessness in the cities. There's wars and rumors of wars. And it's just, 2024 has been a pretty interesting year, to say the least. And so when you look at this, and then also thinking about what you said when Obama was president, I was watching Caroline Glick a few days ago. One of the people that she was interviewing said that, listen, Obama's intention was to make Iran the new head of the new Ottoman Empire, where everything would go through the U.S. and Iran. Israel wouldn't be able to make any of its own decisions. And in a sense, that's the thought of this regional type of thing. Is that correct?
No question about it. In fact, the clearest articulation of this idea that I have seen came from a former terrorist, a former jihadi terrorist called Ed Hussein. His real name is Mohammed Hussein. And he was writing in Foreign Affairs, which is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I believe it was reprinted by the Financial Times or one of the big newspapers, where he openly said it's time to impose a Middle Eastern Union on the Middle East. Right? We've got all these wars. We've got all this conflict. We've got all these regional issues that no country can solve on its own. It's time to put the Jews, the Turks, the Arabs, the Persians, the Kurds, all of them under a Middle Eastern Union that could do for the Middle East what the European Union supposedly did for Europe, which is allegedly bring about peace, safety, prosperity, things like that. Of course, that's not what brought peace, safety, and prosperity to Europe. But be that as it may, they're now at the point where, because they used to kind of talk about this stuff behind closed doors, they're now at the point where they're openly advocating for it. And of course, they're not going to be able to get there tomorrow. Right? They're not going to be able to impose this on people tomorrow. But in the aftermath of a major war, as we just discussed this, right? Lincoln Bloomfield, writing for the U.S. State Department, explained war is the fastest way to get people to give up their national sovereignty and their liberty. So you have a major war, people dead all over the place. Every family has lost a child or two children. Every family has lost a home, mom, dad. People are just, enough, whatever it takes to make this stop, just make it stop. Okay, Middle Eastern Union, fine. Make a Middle Eastern Union. World government, fine. We'll have a world government. Just make it so that there's groceries in the grocery store again, and I can feed my children, and I don't have to send my other children off to go die in the war. When people are desperate, when people are faced with, as you said, anxiety and terror and massive loss and just uncontrollable fear, they become much more willing to accept things that they wouldn't have accepted before. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see the war drums banging all over the world. They want to plunge humanity into a third world war, whether that be the Russians launching nukes on us, whether that be the Iranians launching more attacks on Israel, whether that be the Communist Chinese launching more attacks on the Free Chinese in Taiwan. I don't think it matters that much from the globalist perspective, although Israel, of course, is right in the center of all this. But any way that we can get all the nations of the world killing each other would be, I think, a big win from their perspective.
I think people around the world will just say, make it stop, make it all go away. As you mentioned, we just want to have groceries in the grocery store. We want to have some form of peace. We want to go back to the way it was. I mean, how many times have we heard over the last 4.5 years, couldn't we go back to 2019? But, excuse me, but you look at where we are. Wow. Okay, let me ask you this. Trump, why is he a threat, or is he a threat to the globalists? How do you see this with Trump?
I do believe he's a threat to the globalists, and I know very well-meaning brothers in the Lord who disagree with my analysis of this, and that's fine. I don't claim to be some kind of prophet. I don't claim any special divine insight. But in my experience, in the people that I have talked to, I've talked to multiple members of his previous cabinet. I've talked to some of his top and closest officials and friends. I get the sense that Donald Trump really does oppose this globalist agenda. He really does love America. If you look at what he did in the first term, what you'll see is he was laser focused on taking on globalism. One of his very first actions as president was undermining the so-called Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Not only are they building these regional governments, they're then finding ways to link the regional governments together. So blowing up the TPP is far more significant than your average American understands. And that was one of his first acts in office. This TPP was going to create a Trans-Pacific bureaucracy, Trans-Pacific courts. And after that, he moved like a laser to start dismantling and attacking critical UN infrastructure. So UNESCO, he got us out of the UN's education agency. All these UN documents make clear that brainwashing your children is the primary mechanism they're going to use to bring about this new order. So that is sending an arrow right into the heart of their agenda to bring the world along with this globalist plan. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was absolutely right to get us out of that thing. You look at what he did with the climate scam, right? He got us out of the Paris Agreement. He talked about what a fraud all of this was. He talked about how communist China was benefiting while we were dismantling our economy. All of it, absolutely correct. And I've spent a lot of time with his climate advisor, who's a great scientist, Dr. Will Happer of Princeton University. I've interviewed him many times. And he gets it, right? He gets it. And he's been explaining to Trump what's going on here. You look at what he did to the International Criminal Court, which, of course, is threatening to prosecute Israelis, including the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, threatening to prosecute Americans. And, of course, we have not even signed up to this silly court. We didn't sign up to the Rome Statute. So Donald Trump actually slapped sanctions on this thing and said, you keep terrorizing us and come to the United States, find out what happens. Right? So that was great. He stopped us being involved in the UNRWA, which is the UN entity that actually helped perpetrate the October 7th attacks against the Jews. I mean, what kind of entity is this that's brainwashing Arab children that they need to kill Jews to enter paradise? What kind of entity is this that is participating in terrorist attacks on innocent people? So very wicked organization. He got us out of the World Health Organization. Over and over again, he undermined the architecture of global governance. And I mean, he wasn't shy about it. He went to the floor of the UN General Assembly and told them right to their face, you all should be stopping the globalism. You all should be representing your own nations and putting your own nations first. There's nothing wrong with loving your nation and being patriotic, right? So he really was a hurricane when it came to the architecture of globalism. And I think he was misled on quite a few things. The USMCA was one that I tried really hard on that. I was asked by one of his senior staffers to write a memo for him explaining why this was a bad idea, and I did. And I explained to him that this was, another component in building up this North American Union-style government. And I'm told he read it. Unfortunately, he followed his advisors like Robert Lighthizer, U.S. Trade Representative out of the Council on Foreign Relations, instead of looking objectively at what this did. So I have, of course, some very serious disagreements with him. Operation Warp Speed, I disagree with very strongly. But my assessment of this is that he was deceived by bad advisors, by people who were trying to manipulate him and use him for their purposes. And he wasn't doing it out of malevolence. He wasn't doing it because he supports the globalist deep state agenda. He was doing it because he came out of the business world and he wasn't used to having all these snakes around you that are constantly trying to trick you and all the rest of it. So that's my assessment. I think if he gets a second term, we'll see much more of that. But I also think the globalists will literally try to unleash hell on this planet in an effort to undermine the United States, undermine his presidency, and use that chaos to bring us closer to the one world vision that they have.
So spot on. By the way, we have Alex's book, Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. We have several of Alex's books actually in the Hope for Our Time store, including Indoctrinating Our Children to Death in Government Schools, War on Faith, Family, and Freedom, How to Stop It. But you can get these books, again, Deep State, The Invisible Government Behind the Scenes. It's available in the Hope for Our Time store. Check it out. I guarantee you'll be blessed and you'll be informed. Alex just has a wealth of information, but we're not done yet because he promised me I'd get a few extra minutes today with him. So I'm gonna take it. All right, that was great. I remember the USMCA. Basically it's the same thing, just different name. I remember the getting out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is just a trade agreement to lock everybody underneath this global dictatorship. And I remember when he backed out of the Paris Climate Treaty. I remember, boy, did that get so many people angry. But as we look at all of this globalist agenda,